Hey everybody, and welcome to a special Point North one-shot presentation. Tonight, we are discussing at long last the 1999 movie Galaxy Quest, about which, fair warning, I am fairly positive, about which I have a great deal of enthusiasm. As an old school Star Trek fan, this scratches any itch that I might have. It is a great, insightful, thoughtful pastiche of what Star Trek at its best can be. And it's appropriate that we're discussing Galaxy Quest this week, because this week I also sat down to watch a brand new show, a brand new pastiche of Star Trek, no less. I sat down to watch The Orville, the new Seth MacFarlane series that is currently airing on Fox. And in every way that Galaxy Quest hits the right tone, hits the right aesthetic, hits the right sensibility, hits the right heart, The Orville does not. It is not, as I feared, that The Orville is simply bad, though it certainly isn't good. It's that The Orville is desperately uninspired. And that is perhaps the greatest redeeming quality that Galaxy Quest possesses as a story unto itself. It is complete. Even if you've never seen Star Trek, even if you've never seen a science fiction film, Galaxy Quest tells you a story. It communicates its intent in a way that is universal. And universality can oftentimes be an overstated virtue when we're talking about stories and storytelling, particularly when we're talking about big budget, big screen stories and storytelling. Universality is, of course, appealing to men in suits who write checks, because the larger the potential audience, the more people are going to connect with your story and pay for the privilege, at least in theory. But the truth is that there is a bell curve at work here. There is a sweet spot where you communicate your story to the largest possible number of people who find themselves specifically to be your audience. Galaxy Quest manages to walk that line really rather beautifully. It was a surprising hit, has remained a surprising cult classic, as evidenced by the number of people who are here tonight. It is so good to have you all with me. Angela and Becca and Sosa Sundare is here and Maya is here. This is a busy week at Point North Media. Last night we had our Harry Potter session. Actually, on Monday we had some special announcements about the new Crowdcast environment in which those of you who are watching live currently find yourselves. Then last night we had Dear Mr. Potter. Tonight, the one shot on Galaxy Quest. Tomorrow night, the next episode in our exploration of Tolkien's Middle-earth, In There and Back Again. And then on Friday, we'll do our weekly Q&A wrap-up, just to usher in the weekend in a manner to which it would like to become accustomed. Gildar's Winters is asking, they made a magazine out of Galaxy Quest, right? GQ? Unfortunately, GQ is not a Galaxy Quest magazine. Were it to be a Galaxy Quest magazine, I would expect more pictures of Sigourney Weaver rather than the 2 or 3 that we get in the average issue of GQ. Yes. Good. Okay. So let's get into our discussion, because there really is a lot of material to cover, a lot of ground to cover, not least of all because this is in many ways heralded as the great Star Trek film that wasn't. In a recent poll of all of the Star Trek films, this took place in, well, 2013, so I guess not all that recent, but still pretty recent, fans of Star Trek ranked the Star Trek movies. In the number one spot, we had Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, Star Trek First Contact, then Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country, and I may have my issues with parts of this list, by the way, but those top 3, that's the right top 3, let me tell you. I move back and forth on the order, but those are definitely the 3, they're the 3 good Star Trek films is what it comes down to. Wrath of Khan, First Contact, Undiscovered Country, then The Voyage Home, then The Search for Spock, then J.J. Abrams' 2009 reboot of Star Trek, and then they voted for Galaxy Quest. They ranked Galaxy Quest as a better Star Trek film than Generations and the motion picture and Nemesis and Insurrection and The Final Frontier and Into Darkness and Beyond hadn't come out by that point, but I guarantee that if it had, it would be right there at the bottom of the list. It would not be hanging out in the august company in which we find Galaxy Quest right now. So why is Galaxy Quest so popular? Why is it so beloved of Star Trek fans? Because the Star Trek community, lest we forget, can be a little prickly. It can be a little insular, certainly. It can be a little defensive about those things which it loves the most, as can we all, of course. And that really takes us to the question of parody. What is a parody? What is a pastiche? What is satire? Understanding the distinctions between those 3 terms gives us, I think, a powerful insight into what it is that makes Galaxy Quest as a movie work. So let's take satire first, because satire is the one of those three that we're not going to be dealing with during tonight's discussion. Satire exaggerates the elements of style and content associated with a given work or a given body of work in order to achieve a primarily transformative effect. Satire wants you to be angry. Satire wants things to change. Parody, similarly, exaggerates the elements of style and of tone and of visual design and visual aesthetic of content in general associated with a given work or a given body of work in order to achieve a primarily comedic effect. Parody doesn't want you angry. Parody just wants you to laugh. But crucially, parody and satire both exaggerate. They both heighten the content of the core text. They are both in that way reflexive. Both parody and satire depend upon an intertextual awareness of the source material. You can't read, I always go to this example, and I really need to find a better example because I don't care for these books at all, but you can't read the books of the Harvard Lampoon without knowing the original source text. Lord of the Rings will make no sense to you unless you read Lord of the Rings, unless you already know and have internalized the tone and the spirit of that original book. Pastiche, though, is different, because pastiche doesn't seek to heighten the tone or the style or the elements of the content of the source story. It simply seeks to replicate them. The Orville is a pastiche, because the Orville is very clearly trying to replicate Star Trek: The Next Generation in the most mundane and minute and thoughtless way. But Galaxy Quest is also, in large part, in at least its second act, pastiche. Galaxy Quest plays its story straight. Once the story is moving, it plays the story straight. It absolutely replicates the structures of TV science fiction, as well it might. And in so doing, it manages to communicate not just that core narrative, which works on its own terms, crucially, but manages to hit many of the same high points that we associate with the original series of Star Trek or The Next Generation or, the original series of Battlestar Galactica, shows like that. It manages to have some of that wide-eyed optimism. It manages to have some of that hope. It manages to have some of that humanity. It manages to do what good sci-fi does. It isn't just a reference point. It is a story that works on its own terms. And Galaxy Quest is a particularly interesting beast in this regard because it is parodic in its first act. That first act is a parody of, a number of elements. Primarily, of course, we're parodying William Shatner through Tim Allen's performance as Jason Nesmith. We're parodying that kind of somewhat heroic, somewhat over-heroic pop culture icon figure who is yearning for the heyday, who has so completely embodied that particular character that there now is a sense that there's little left of the actor behind that character. This is, of course, a huge exaggeration of William Shatner's role in the real world. This is not terribly fair, but it is a pastiche of our kind of pop cultural understanding of who William Shatner is. Then, as I say, in the second act, we move from parody into pastiche. Nothing here is heightened. By the time we're having our space adventure, by the time we're going after the beryllium sphere, even by the time that we're fighting back against Saris, we're no longer engaged in parody. We then return to parody right at the end of the movie, but it's a parody of a different sort because the tone that we've established in space is now brought literally crashing down to Earth. And there is a tension created there by those differing scales. So we parody in the first act, we pastiche in the second, and then we kind of parody again in the closing moments of the movie. Much of the climax is also pastiche, which is to say that it is not heightened, it is kind of playing fair. It is kind of telling the story that it showed up to tell. And that is where the heart can be found. It is very difficult, not impossible, but very difficult to maintain heart, to maintain authenticity in a parodic form, because you are not there to tell a story. This is what separates, in part, parody and satire from pastiche. Pastiche exists according to the same rules as any other story. It is here to convey something to you. It is here to elicit an emotional response from you. Parody and satire are there to do that too, but not narratively. They can't do it narratively because they rest upon that intertextual understanding. And that is what separates, for me at least, Galaxy Quest. Let's see here. I'm getting some pushback here. Is this pushback? Is this support for Shatner? Yeah, no, exactly. As Angela Louise says, it makes me think of Shatner's SNL skit when he tells the fans to get a life. Exactly. That is what is being parodied. Not William Shatner, the man, but William Shatner, the post-Kirk kind of, I guess, kind of late 80s to mid 90s kind of Shatner that we got, where he was, I guess even earlier than that. I suppose there are aspects of this that have run through Shatner's entire career since the original series wrapped. But yes, this is not fair to him as an actor, but it is, I think, fair to him as a public persona, or at least this facet of his public persona. So let's talk a little about the movie itself. This movie starring, I mean, just a knockout cast. Tim Allen and Sigourney Weaver and Alan Rickman and Tony Shalhoub and Sam Rockwell and Daryl Mitchell, who I adore from the short-lived, quirky, small-town TV series Ed, which is pretty great. Daryl Mitchell's wonderful in that. This movie came out, as I said, in 1999. It was released on Christmas Day of 1999 by DreamWorks Pictures. And it didn't do badly, is the thing. It didn't set the world on fire. 1999 was a weird year for movies, as we'll discuss in just a moment. But Galaxy Quest didn't set the world on fire, but it made its money back. It made a decent profit, too. It was a fine B-tier movie of the kind that we don't actually get anymore because there's no money to be made, no real money to be made in B-tier movies. There's just not enough potential upside. So nobody would make a movie like Galaxy Quest now, which is, of course, why Galaxy Quest is in talks constantly at, various streaming networks. The latest idea, I think, is that Paul Scheer is attached to a Galaxy Quest TV property at Amazon. We'll see. I know no more about that than I've just said, so I can't really get too deeply into that. In addition, of course, to that great cast that I just outlined, this movie introduces Rainn Wilson, who would go on to some major success in The Office in his first movie role, and Justin Long, who would go on to, well, less success, but who is, I find, a fascinating actor and an actor that I'm always glad to see on my screen. This is his first movie, too. Galaxy Quest came from a script written by playwright David Howard. The original script was called Captain Starshine. Maybe a better title, even. I mean, obviously a worse title in like a dozen ways, but also maybe a better title. Captain Starshine was David Howard's script, and it was considered by DreamWorks for development and production. But after reading the script, the only thing that the heads of DreamWorks liked was the core concept. What if an alien culture out there in the reaches of space picked up some TV sci-fi from Earth and misconstrued it as an historical document, misconstrued it as an account of real life and reformatted their society around it? That's basically all that Galaxy Quest has in common with Captain Starshine. DreamWorks offered the idea to Robert Bob Gordon, who had previously written the Meg Ryan, Matthew Broderick romantic comedy Addicted to Love, which is a surprisingly charming film. And Gordon and David Howard developed the script for what became Galaxy Quest. So just to keep track there, 2 writers, 4 first names, Bob Gordon, David Howard. There's clearly a pattern here. If you want to work in Hollywood, go get yourself another first name. The movie was greenlit based on the first draft of the script. There wasn't even a script revision, and the first version of the script is apparently very close to the script that was used for shooting. That script was offered first to Harold Ramis to direct. He wanted to cast Alec Baldwin in the lead role, which would have been a weird movie, you guys, but Baldwin wasn't interested, and Ramis ultimately passed on the movie after the role was given to Tim Allen. He was, at the time, apparently, a little critical of Tim Allen, a little unimpressed with the prospects of working with the man. Later, after the movie had come out, Harold Ramis recanted and praised Tim Allen's performance in this movie. Following Ramis's departure, DreamWorks gave the script to Dean Parisot to direct. Parisot had previously directed episodes of Northern Exposure. He's very good directing that show, a handful of other TV shows, a couple other movies, including Home Fries, a low-key, low-budget domestic drama, which is notable only because it has a script by Vince Gilligan, who would later go on to direct, to write and to showrun and to direct Breaking Bad. Dean Parisot hadn't yet tried his hand at this kind of relatively big budget, kind of B-tier sci-fi adventure. The budget for this film was $45 million. For comparison, let's look at some other movies that came out in 1999. Fight Club and The Matrix, both released in 1999, had budgets of $63 million compared to Galaxy Quest's $45 million. The Mummy, which we're going to talk about in a one-shot discussion in the very near future, thanks to Patreon supporter Aaron Sosa Sundare, who is right here with us tonight in the Crowdcast chat. The Mummy had a budget of $80 million, so almost twice the budget of Galaxy Quest. These movies, though, are dwarfed by Wild Wild West. Wild Wild West, which had come out in the summer, 6 months before Galaxy Quest, had a budget of $170 million. That means for, numbers fans among you that you could make The Matrix, Fight Club, and Galaxy Quest for roughly the same amount of money that it took to make Wild Wild West. I'll leave the inevitable conclusions to you. Off that $45 million budget, Galaxy Quest took $90 million at the box office, which, as I say, made it a middling success. Usually a movie has to double its budget in order to be considered a success of any kind, because the budget doesn't necessarily tell the whole story. The budget doesn't necessarily cover advertising costs and promotional costs and marketing costs and things like that. So in order for everyone to feel pretty good about the project, the movie has to double its budget, and Galaxy Quest did. Just a middling kind of performance. It was the 30th highest grossing film in US movie theaters in 1999. But what's interesting about Galaxy Quest is that its reputation, I think, has only improved over the years. It has only garnered a larger and more enthusiastic following as time has passed, as is evidenced by the number of us who are hanging out here tonight. A shock here at Wild Wild West. And a few defenders of Wild Wild West. I was just having this conversation. I saw Wild Wild West in, maybe 2001, maybe 2002 on DVD. I have seen it once. I didn't hate it when I watched it. That's about as much as I can say. I'm very interested to go back. Maybe we'll just complete our trifecta of 1999 movies. We'll talk about Galaxy Quest. We'll talk about The Mummy. And then, rather than talking about Fight Club or The Matrix, we'll talk about Wild Wild West instead. That seems pretty good, right? Seems pretty good. Okay, let me dip into the question bucket here and see if we have some questions. Yes, Becca Eller asks, can we please take a minute to gush about Sigourney Weaver and how she is just lovely and fantastic? Also, how much we collectively miss Alan Rickman. It is kind of hard watching this movie right now. As many of you probably know, I am deep in Harry Potter territory because I am currently producing the third season of Dear Mr. Potter, looking at Prisoner of Azkaban, and I've been watching that film, pretty much once a month for the last few months, just to kind of stay in that world. And I recently watched the back half of the entire Harry Potter series because I had a little time on my hands, and what better way of spending that than watching the rest of Harry Potter? Yes, Alan Rickman is deeply missed. He is extraordinary in this film. Extraordinary in this film. And this is, I think, the greatest compliment that you can pay Alan Rickman. It doesn't matter the role. It doesn't matter the quality of the movie, the quality of the script, the budget that he is given. Alan Rickman delivers a consummate performance every single time. There is never the sense, I have never had the sense, that Alan Rickman has phoned in a performance. And what he does with Dr. Lazarus, the depth that he gives, well, not Dr. Lazarus, I suppose, the depth that he gives Alexander Dane playing Dr. Lazarus, and the sucker punch of an emotional turn that we get in the third act of this movie, it's astounding. It's startling how good and how sophisticated and how respectful it is of his audience. I yield to no one in my admiration of Alan Rickman, nor yet in my admiration of Sigourney Weaver, who is just extraordinary in this film. And I've just recently been thinking a lot about Sigourney Weaver because I just recently watched the Netflix Defenders series, in which she plays the primary antagonist for our street-level heroes in the Marvel version of New York City. And I started thinking about Sigourney Weaver's career and how now she can just show up, and she has an immediate gravitas. She has an immediate presence. She shows up to basically be Sigourney Weaver, which is not to suggest that she either has ever, to the best of my recollection, phoned in a performance. She's extremely good and an extremely skilled performer. But at this point in her career, things were very different. There is still here a connection back to Alien, to her work in the Alien franchise at this point. She hadn't yet become the Duchess of high concept sci-fi. She hadn't got to that point yet. She is magnificent in this role. She is completely without ego, completely without pretense or facade. She delivers an enormously human performance as Gwen, and then as we move into the second act of the movie and her identity starts to blur, the identity between, her off-screen and on-screen persona starts to blur, as is the case with all of our primary cast, she manages to bring a kind of a breathless, winsome charm, and yet still that fierce Sigourney Weaver intellect. That, I think, is the only kind of criticism isn't the word, right? But that is the only quality that I can point to in Sigourney Weaver's performances. No matter the film, no matter what she is doing, she brings the smarts. She brings this enormously acute and bladed intellect to every performance that she gives, even when that isn't necessarily entirely appropriate. Can't help but love her for that, though. I just can't help but love her for that. So Sundari, Aaron asks here, too, this takes place over 3 days, right? Does Alan Rickman never take off that costume head? No, he doesn't. And that is, I think, entirely purposeful. And we get a glimpse of this. It took me a long time to understand how careful the opening act, really the opening movement of this story is. There's so much crammed into these opening moments that serves the story later. We're not quite at, Edgar Wright levels of callback here. There are elements introduced at the beginning of the film that don't really pay off as powerfully as, we might want them to in an idealized, perfect version of this film. But there's a lot of material right up front that introduces us to these characters. And I'm thinking in particular of the very short scene that we get after Jason Nesmith has his meltdown at the con, after the infamous bathroom scene, which was apparently based on a real life experience that William Shatner had at a Star Trek convention. After Nesmith melts down and leaves, we get the very short sequence of Gwen and Alexander talking on the phone, and she's in her apartment, which looks exactly as you would expect her apartment to look, and he's in his apartment, which looks exactly as shabby and awful as you would expect his apartment to look, but he's still wearing the head. Why is he doing that? Well, we're going to talk about identity, and we're going to talk about authenticity in just a few minutes, because that, I think, is the core of this film. That is what this film ultimately is about, which is odd in a way, because the movie does kind of set us up to see something else here. It does set us up to understand a somewhat different theme. When we meet Malthazar right at the beginning of the movie, and even through the first half of the film, he talks a lot about the model of friendships that he has witnessed in the historical records of the Galaxy Quest and the voyages of the Protector. But friendship and teamwork are secondary themes in this movie. They're not the point. The point of this film is, well, you've just got to set aside your ego and be a part of the team, and then you can pull it together. This is not the Mighty Ducks in space. This, though, gosh, I would give a lot of money for the Mighty Ducks in space. I've just realized that. Okay, none of you can write that down. I have to, print out a copy of this podcast and email it to myself so that I can have that idea now forever. This is not the Mighty Ducks in space. This is something very different, because what we're seeing is the integration of every individual character, and thereafter, kind of secondarily and almost without conscious planning, the integration of the team, the integration of the crew. And that ultimately is what saves the day. So that, I think, is very intentional. It is purposeful that Alan Rickman doesn't take the head off, because for all of his protestations, Alexander Dane is Dr. Lazarus. These two characters have coexisted. These two personalities, these two souls, these two essences have coexisted for so long that there is no truth here without integration. And of course, we get that delivered most powerfully toward the end of the film. Aaron says in the chat, the Mighty Ducks in Space is the team up with the cast from The Last Starfighter, right? I love The Last Starfighter, you guys. That is a movie that I could talk about for a good long time too. Yes. Yeah, a lot of love here for oh, it's so sad. It's just so sad. Yeah. Unfortunately, this is the inevitable the inevitable consequence of growing older. You lose actors like Alan Rickman, who you just adored, and sometimes all we can do is remember and celebrate their work while we still have it. Let's keep going on. Let me take a look at my notes. I'm kind of jumping around all over the place. I tend to jump around all over the place when I'm doing these one shots, because I just get into this conversational flow with you guys, and that's oftentimes enough. I did want to note something really interesting, actually, that I read about today and then went back to kind of look into, to study a little bit. The aspect ratio of this film is really interesting. Those of you who don't care about cinematography and such things possibly wouldn't even notice this. The aspect ratio of any given piece of video is the shape of the screen. It is given as a ratio of the width to the height of the screen. So you can get very square, boxy kind of frames, you know, the way that you used to back in the 1980s on television, where you would get a 4:3 frame that was, you know, almost square, or you can get a pretty stretched out, you know, 16:9 kind of widescreen image. That's probably what you have on your TV at home. Or you can get like a 1.85:1 super widescreen image, which is what a lot of movies are projected in. Or you can go still further and get like a 2.35:1 ratio, where you get a very, very wide image. This is a very wide image that is not at all tall. So the horizontal dimension there is 2.35 times larger than the vertical dimension. What's fascinating about Galaxy Quest, and I completely love this incidental detail, is that, of course, the opening of the film, where we're seeing the original 1980s Galaxy Quest TV series, is presented to us in 4:3. It's actually not quite 4:3, which is an interesting choice, but it's basically 4:3. It looks like 1980s television on your movie screen or on your widescreen display at home now. And then the rest of the movie is in 2.35:1, this extra widescreen standard cinematic format. But originally, when the movie aired in theaters, it actually used 3 different aspect ratios. It had the 4:3 cut of the original 1980s TV Galaxy Quest at the beginning, and then it moved out to a 1.85:1 kind of widescreen, but not super widescreen format. So the first act of the film, everything up to Nesmith arriving on the Protector, the kind of first real encounter with Saris, everything up to that point is in 1.85:1, and then it moves to 2.35:1. So we get this expansion from the 4:3 very square image out to a wider widescreen image. And then only when the movie really starts, only when we leave Earth behind, only when we get into space and we begin to sense the kernel of heroism within James Nesmith's, you know, pigeon breast, only when we get to that point and the world opens up do we actually move into the format that we will maintain for the rest of the movie. That is a tiny little incidental detail that you would never notice, I think, if you weren't paying very close attention to it. And certainly, I never, you know, knew about this. I've never seen Galaxy Quest in theaters, so I had never experienced this for myself. But I find this completely fascinating because what it speaks to is a sense of control. It speaks to a sense of, well, it speaks, I guess, primarily to a respect for the source material. It gives us the 4:3 aspect ratio, it gives us the conventional widescreen aspect ratio, then it gives us the super widescreen aspect ratio, because it understands how the shape of the story, literally the shape of the frame in front of us, influences our understanding of the world, of the possibility space that we are about to enter. That's just really smart storytelling, and it's respectful of a universe that is theoretically at least anchored in a show that aired on network television. And if you were around in 1999, I wasn't paying a lot of attention to Galaxy Quest in 1999, and certainly the marketing in Britain and Scotland, where I lived at the time, was not what it was here in the United States. But there was a kind of alternate reality push for Galaxy Quest, where I think it was the E! Network ran shows treating Galaxy Quest as though it were a real program, as though it had actually aired. What is the closest equivalent? I suppose the closest equivalent is probably the original Battlestar Galactica, right? You know, aired alongside that kind of Galactica 1980 kind of slot. It is wildly ingenious to approach a story of this form with that kind of marketing, and apparently successful enough that the movie earned its money back. Yes, John is asking in the chat, does it go back to 1.85:1 at the end where they go back to Earth? It does not, which, on the one hand, I would have really liked that. That would have showed some really nice bracketing. It would have showed an understanding, a real intentionality there. But I think that you can also read an intentionality into the decision to maintain it at 2.35:1, which is simply that the world is larger. And once the world is larger, it can never be smaller. We have kind of achieved our goal. You know what? I am circling the theme of identity and integration here. So let's talk about that, and then we'll kind of take a look at the structure of the movie as a whole. The most interesting thing about Galaxy Quest, I think, is the way that it interrogates these questions of identity and authenticity as the cornerstone of virtue and of heroism and, crucially, of happiness. Nesmith, at the beginning of the film, has pretty much completely surrendered his own actual identity. He is now, I suppose, playing the part of the guy who played Taggart on Galaxy Quest. He's kind of in this hybrid space where he himself, as an actor, as a human being, apparently doesn't really exist. He turns to Taggart for definition. He turns to the response to Taggart for affirmation. That's obviously very, very powerful for him. And it isn't just that he is living off of his glory days. It isn't just that he's parasitically absorbing the adulation of his fans, though that is clearly the case too. We are specifically told twice in the opening sequence that he needs Taggart. The first, as in the bathroom scene where he overhears the ironic con crashers criticizing him, as I say, a scene that was based on a real life experience of William Shatner. When we see how crushed he is by this, we understand that no, for all of his facade of hyper confidence, for all that he is playing the role of the guy who played the role, this does matter to him. There is a real emotional vulnerability here. This is significant. Then we get a much more telling scene, and this kind of fits alongside the scenes of Gwen and Alexander talking to each other, and the insight that we get on their character and on their individual relationships with Nesmith too. But we get the scene where he goes home and he crashes out with pantsless with his bottle of scotch in front of the TV, and he's flipping channels until he finds Galaxy Quest, and he finds identity in his on-screen persona. He finds identity in Taggart. And we can tell that it's not just, again, it's not just celebrity, it's not just success, it's not just the adulation of his fans. It's something more important than that, because he has to echo the lines. He has to perform again. He has to be that guy again. And we see the satisfaction that he gets from that, this cold comfort of satisfaction perhaps, but it's still something. He is as much Taggart as he is Nesmith. And ultimately, his arc is going to see him integrate the two sides of his character. And then, as I say, integrate almost incidentally into a crew of people who have also all been wrestling with this question of identity, of authenticity. All, I suppose, save Fred Kwan, save Tech Sergeant Chen, who doesn't seem to have that problem with integration, but does perhaps have some other problems instead. So we get Sigourney Weaver as Gwen DeMarco as Tawny Madison, and she battles her own apparent irrelevance. This, I've always found it really interesting that in the fake opening that we get to the Galaxy Quest TV show, she's doing this kung fu move, and she replicates that kung fu move when she comes out on stage at the con right at the beginning of the movie. But there is nothing in her characterization that suggests that she was the action girl of the series. There's nothing in the show that suggests that, oh no, she was actually the muscle. Now, I can completely buy her being promoted as the muscle because, a hot girl doing kung fu was absolutely a staple of TV marketing in the late 1970s and early 1980s. And it's interesting that we actually date Galaxy Quest. We date that episode, the last two-parter, as airing in 1982, because it is clear already that it is a throwback. It doesn't feel like a TV show from 1982. It feels like Galactica. It feels like, or Buck Rogers. It feels like a show from 79. It's already out of date by the time that it becomes irrelevant. So that kind of presentation of Gwen's character, of Tawny's character, Tawny Madison, all of the names in this are just the best, by the way. I'll just kind of gloss that right now and just say they're all fantastic, and I love them all very much. So she is wrestling with this question of irrelevance. Is she just a pair of boobs that is poured into a jumpsuit? Which, again, just to kind of continue the direct echoes that we're getting of the Star Trek cast, the story that she tells about 6 paragraphs about her boobs and how her jumpsuit fits, that is directly taken from the experience of Jerry Ryan, who starred as Seven of Nine on Star Trek Voyager. And if you've seen Jerry Ryan's outfit, it is even more, well, gosh, I was going to say exploitative, but you know what? That is me making a value judgment about the career of Jerry Ryan and about the fictional career of Gwen DeMarco too. It is even more salacious and male-gazy than Gwen's outfit, than Tawny's outfit in the Galaxy Quest TV show / movie. It is interesting too that right at the end of the movie, when we get the flash forward to Galaxy Quest: The Next Generation, which takes or is produced 17 years after the original series, it is interesting that she does in fact seem to be more of an action girl. She does in fact seem to be more capable and direct and possessed of greater agency. But in the body of the text, in this long elongated second act into the third act, we see her struggle against her own irrelevance. She is there simply to what? Well, trivially to repeat the computer, yes, but also to kind of functionally mediate between our characters and the completely unfathomable, you know, infinite cosmic excess of the technobabble technology, the track tech that kind of underpins the world of Galaxy Quest. And that, as it turns out, isn't useless. That isn't a terrible thing. It is useless that she has to repeat everything to the computer and from the computer. Like, that itself is not a worthwhile role. But the idea that she acts as a mediator, and we must remember that she is basically, you know, a Lieutenant Uhura kind of character. That's the communications officer archetype, with, of course, a healthy dose of Deanna Troi from Next Gen kind of thrown in there. She's not empathic, but she is every bit as useful to the developing plot. Oh, we're talking about 7 of 9 here. Gildarts Winters confirms that she is a pair of boobs poured into a jumpsuit. Good to know. Good to know. Check. Oh, Aaron points out that the graphics are way too good for 1982. Yeah, it's, again, when you present the past in this kind of format, you're not really presenting the past. You're presenting what we remember the past looking like. So the graphics don't look like they did in 1982. They look the way that we remember them looking in 1982, which is actually much closer to, what, 1987, 1988, I guess. But yes, and sometimes making bad graphics is more expensive than making good graphics, particularly once we move to the age of you know, entirely digital compositions. Yeah, Becca points out also poor Troy and her uncomfortable costumes. Yes, yes. Good. All right. So we've got Sigourney Weaver playing that role and wrestling with her own kind of integration and ultimately coming to a much more stable place. She is never fighting. Gwen is never fighting Tawny the way that, well, Alexander is fighting Dr. Lazarus, right? Alan Rickman as Alexander Dane as Dr. Lazarus is the counterpoint to Nesmith. He is the Lancer to Nesmith's hero. He is the kind of dark shadow of Nesmith, as Nesmith is inextricably linked to Taggart, as he is kind of osmotically absorbed by this creature that he has created, or at least, you know, breathed life into. So there is never any confusion between Alexander Dane and Dr. Lazarus, at least superficially. And yet there's the head, this awful latex prosthetic head that he wears throughout the entire movie, that he apparently just wears throughout his entire life. Alexander gives us an insight into what happens when we reject, both consciously and subconsciously, the elements of our own character that we breathe life into through the performative art. You know, he created Dr. Lazarus, and now Dr. Lazarus has come to define him. And we get, I mean, I can't go through the entire movie. I can't go through the entire movie and just quote every single one of Alan Rickman's lines. I could. I mean, I love them all. They are all, I think, peerless. When he's complaining right at the beginning, I played Richard III. It's so strong. But the best, of course, at least the best of Alexander kind of pre-integration, the best version of that line I think we get is in the parking lot with the opening of the Tech Superstore, by Grabthar's hammer, longest pause in cinematic history. What a savings. It's beautifully constructed, you guys. It's impeccably done. The script is incredibly strong, but the performance does everything that it should. The self-loathing, literal self-loathing. He is hating a part of himself. And that's the arc that he takes. The response of the fans at the con, the response of the innumerable people who come up and repeat this tired, worn out, nonsensical catchphrase to him, that doesn't do anything for him. That doesn't reaffirm him. What is required in order for him to integrate with Dr. Lazarus is the personal connection that he has in the course of the movie. And then when he says the line and means it, we get that, again, complete integration. We have his identity now. He is Alexander Dane, yes, and he is Dr. Lazarus. Yes, he is the best parts of both, and being integrated allows him to access his true virtue, his true heroism, his true sense of self in a way that he couldn't before. Then we get the wonderful Daryl Mitchell as Tommy Webber, as young Laredo, as the precocious pilot of the Protector, the Wesley Crusher character on board the Protector in Galaxy Quest. And he, of course, is wrestling with the greatest kind of experiential discontinuity that you can ever face in your life. He was a child, and now he's not. He is literally a different person. It's not even about young Laredo as a character. The tension that we see from Tommy is between his childhood performance and his new adult self, his more snarky, more wry, more worldly adult self. And he has to integrate that simplicity, that naivete, that innocence into his real world experience. It's no coincidence that for all that Alexander is the bitter, caustic, cynical one, most of the snark in the movie comes from Tommy. He's the one that's undercutting everything. He's the one now who is the opposite of wide-eyed and awestruck by the splendor and the beauty of the galaxy spread out before him. There's none of that now. He just has to reintegrate his childhood self into his adult self, which, of course, he too does. He accomplishes this. And as I said earlier, a quick note about Tech Sergeant Chen, about Fred Kwan. He is never as disintegrated as the other members of the cast, which I think allows him to take all of this in stride. But also we're getting something odd in that performance. I have never quite been able to figure out what it is that Tony Shalhoub is doing. I mean, he's doing a number of different things, is the thing. Certainly, given his names, Fred Kwan and Tech Sergeant Chan, I mean, I don't want to put too fine a point on it, you guys, but Tony Shalhoub is not Asian. He's Lebanese in ethnic origin and ethnic derivation. That does, I think, speak to this notion of having white actors, having. Okay, let me kind of frame this as best and as broadly as I can. Having European and European adjacent actors playing basically any ethnicity you like. Basically anything will be fine. Oh, they're not white? Nah, that'll be fine. Not even completely white. And we get this weird beat from Tony Shalhoub all through the movie that whenever he's addressed by name, he will kind of squint a bit. And I don't know if that's just a character affectation or if he's leaning into the idea that either side of his characterization, either Fred Kwan or Tech Sergeant Chan, are supposed to be in some way Asian. I genuinely don't know. I don't know what he's doing in this movie. I don't know what the underlying kind of motivation for this character is, but I do know that I love it. I do know that it works for me. I do know that I am emotionally connected to this guy and that I love him fiercely. So I guess it can work even if I don't quite understand it. Yeah, Aaron says here, they were making fun of whitewashing, I think. Having a guy who is not white substituting another non-white role. Yes, yes. Is that a remark on Chekhov, asks Angela Laree. Yes, I mean, this is a little less specifically Star Trek and a little more kind of generic kind of, I mean, not even just sci-fi, but network TV in the 70s and 80s. There was a lot of whitewashing going on, you guys, just a ton. Yeah. Yeah, Aaron says, briefly in the opening, his eye makeup was with, I can only imagine Aaron is adding here as I am giant scare quotes around this, but yes, his eye makeup was Asian. I just don't know what we're supposed to be doing with that. It doesn't quite land in terms of its intentionality, but it absolutely lands in terms of its vulnerability. Speaking of which, Sam Rockwell as Guy. God, I adore Sam Rockwell, you guys. I just love him. As I said earlier when I was talking about... I suppose, about both Sigourney Weaver and Alan Rickman. Sam Rockwell delivers a performance that is so completely devoid of ego that it's bordering, in the first instance at least, on the charmless. Guy is a difficult character to like because the performance is so disarmingly uncharming, so disarmingly purposeful. So much of it feels unintentional. It's spectacular. Guy, of course, is, in terms of our ongoing discussion of identity and integration, kind of wrestling with the question of identity itself. He doesn't have an identity. He doesn't have a last name. What are you supposed to do when, instead of being a person, a character, possessed of feelings and motivations and personal history all your own, and God knows a last name too, what are you supposed to do when, instead of being that character, you are a numerically denotated plot device? What is identity when you don't have identity. It's absolutely fascinating. The degree to which we don't get a strong sense of I could stand to have a little more of Guy as an actor himself. I want to know what took this guy to hosting, the Galaxy Quest convention right at the beginning of the film. I want to know a little more about that before I'm completely, happy to sign off on his characterization, but absolutely convincing. And again, he too arcs into this integration to the degree that he even gets his last name. So, and okay, let's take a moment to kind of pull this out even more broadly. Yes, crewman number 6. Yes, that's right. As Aaron says, Sam Rockwell was so meta, I didn't really like him until he got cleavage and you saw the blatant tan line. Yes, it's pretty good. It's pretty good. And of course, that's a huge play, as I'm sure all of you know, that's a huge play off the notion of the red shirt in Star Trek, which it's only really when you go back and you watch Star Trek The Next Generation that you realize, because for all that we talk about it, not that many red shirts die in the original Star Trek, you guys, just not that many. But the notion of someone gets beaten up or killed in order to demonstrate the power of this week's, temporary threat, this monster of the week, that is a ubiquitous hallmark of Star Trek The Next Generation. It is crazy how often they go to that well, and it's almost always Worf, which is pretty great. Worf getting knocked around by the monster of the week is a drinking game when you watch Next Gen. It's a pretty fun one. Don't watch too many episodes in one evening, or you'll not remember it and then have to watch them again, and that's just a cycle that will continue forever. Good. Oh, this is great. Gildarts Winter says identity without is simply a state of non-being. Yes. Oh, and Angela and Aaron are both recommending Moon, in which Sam Rockwell is spectacular. Sam Rockwell, longtime real life friend with Kevin Spacey. Sam Rockwell was going to drop out of Galaxy Quest because he got the lead in another movie, and he went to his friend Kevin Spacey and said, "Hey, I've got a lead in this movie." And Kevin Spacey says, "Are you nuts? This is an ensemble piece. This is going to be a paycheck for the next couple of years, and it's going to raise your profile." And of course, turned out that he was absolutely right. The reason that I mentioned Kevin Spacey, of course, is that Sam Rockwell and Kevin Spacey are basically the two actors who contribute their performative services to Duncan Jones' fantastic movie Moon. That was Duncan Jones' debut feature, right? That was his first movie. This is David Bowie's son, Duncan Jones, who is a very talented and skilled director. Moon is a knockout. That would actually be a really great topic for a future Point North one-shot. If I ever get into a rhythm where I'm doing like old school, high concept, hard sci-fi, if I ever do, Blade Runner and 2001, movies like that, then Moon would sit very happily alongside, a little silent running, little, yeah. Kevin Spacey is a national treasure, says Rayla Lynn. I completely agree. I do adore him very much. So all of this talk of identity, good Lord, I'm almost out of time already. Okay. All of this talk of identity, of course, is mirrored not just in the internal arcs of all of our characters, but is echoed in the foundational kind of core narrative conflict here. The Thermians themselves are not authentic. The Thermians themselves have adopted this veneer of another civilization. They have, in an effort to stave off the decline and devastation of their own culture, copied outright the fictional culture of planet Earth, I suppose, of whatever Federation analog there is in the Galaxy Quest universe. They have mimicked this other culture, and they've done so beautifully. They are scientists, and because they are unfamiliar with the concepts of deception, they can't engage with this in a way that is okay. They can do this inauthentic thing, but they do it with an absolute authenticity, with an absolute adherence to the source text there. And in their way, the Thermians themselves are representative of what Galaxy Quest is doing. They begin almost parodically. The idea of the brilliant Enrico Colantoni, who is fantastic in literally everything. The man has never turned in a bad performance in his entire life, is an absolute standout in the otherwise also extremely very good Veronica Mars TV show and movie, which is probably where you know him from best. But he is fantastic in this film, and yet not right, not true in an interesting way. He comes to truth through the arc of the film in exactly the same way as the rest of our heroes come to truth, and in so doing is emblematic of Thermian society. He is kind of dressed in the clothes. You know, he is talking the talk, but not yet walking the, I mean, literally not walking the walk. The weird Thermian, you know, Thunderbird puppet hand motion walk is, God, one of my favorite things. It cracks me up every time I see it. So Thermian culture itself is inauthentic, that they are caught between the truth of their nature as many tentacled squid people and this kind of aspirational performative aspect of themselves, this recreation of the Galaxy Quest TV show. And we find, again, that power, that heroism, that virtue and valor come from integration. And that brings us, I suppose, to our gloss of the structure of Galaxy Quest. We can talk more about identity. We can talk about Saris. We can talk about Brandon, Justin Long, Brandon. I always forget the character's name, but I'm pretty sure it's Brandon. Oh, and forgive me too. I need to look up the actor's name. The actor's name is Robin Sachs. Robin Sachs is the actor who plays Saris. He is the actor inside the brilliantly 1980s rubber suit of Saris. Quick little Easter egg for you that I only found out today. I've seen this movie 20 times and never noticed this before. But that guy, Robin Sachs, in addition to playing Saris, also plays Justin Long's dad in that tiny little beat right at the end of the movie, which I just adore. I just love that there's some symmetry there, some echoing there. So we can talk about, you know, identity there too. We can talk about what is real and what is not real. We can talk about the furious maelstrom of identity and counter-identity that is adolescence, that is fan culture too. I mean, good Lord, all of these people dressed up as their favorite characters at the convention at the beginning. Is that not in some way a very limited and generally very healthy way? A search for identity or an expression of identity, a definition of identity? This is the core thematic framework that Galaxy Quest gives us. So that takes us into a quick gloss here of the structure. Galaxy Quest is pretty much a knockout 3-act structure. It does have a slightly elongated first act. It does take us a little bit to get in. Galaxy Quest as a story makes much more sense when we understand that we have, for all that it is an ensemble cast, we have one protagonist. This is Jason Nesmith's story. This is, I guess I haven't really talked about Tim Allen during this entire thing, have I? Tim Allen, obviously a problematic individual in real life. You guys, actually, particularly in 1999, a fairly talented and charming performer. I like the performance that he gives here as Jason Nesmith. I like the vulnerability of it. Again, surprisingly devoid of ego, even as, let me separate this out here. Nesmith, never devoid of ego. Tim Allen actually curiously devoid of ego. There are some great moments of humanity and vulnerability. That beat in the bathroom, the beat where he's home alone drinking scotch, watching TV. And then, of course, the midpoint of the entire movie, the turning point where it is revealed to the Thermians that the historical records are not, in fact, historical records. And we get this moment that haunts me. This moment of simple performance that completely haunts me. Firstly, we get Nesmith stepping up. He admits the truth. This is a thing that he hasn't done since 1982. This is a thing that he hasn't done since he actually was that guy. He says, I'm not the commander. He is absolutely drawing that line. He is disavowing that other side of himself, that side of himself that has been so important. So he says, I'm not the commander. He disavows it in order to save Malthazar and the other Thermians, right? Then we get, fantastically, unexpectedly, brilliantly, we get Sigourney Weaver playing her part completely straight. We get Gwen playing her part completely straight. When she then relays the request for the historical documents to the computer, we've literally just played this as a joke like 4 times over. We do this all the time, but now we're playing it straight. And it carries real emotional weight. By this point, of course, we are well past the point at which parody has kind of yielded its terrain. It has kind of yielded to pastiche at this point. The short little 1-episode adventure for the Beryllium Sphere, you know, which has exactly that classic structure of a Star Trek episode. By the way, if you just go and watch the Beryllium Sphere sequence, that is an episode of Star Trek. It's perfect. It's beautiful. The references are on point, but they're not too heightened. It works really nicely. So then we get this moment of revelation. The TV show, the historical document starts playing and Saris laughs. And that moment, I mean, everything that follows thereafter is genuinely upsetting, like genuinely difficult to watch, genuinely emotionally intense. But that moment when he laughs because he gets it and the Thermians don't, that for me is an epic. That is an all-time epic turning point, right slap bang in the middle of the movie. That is the point. This is kind of this kind of takes the form of an epiphanic midpoint. I've talked before in other podcasts about the kind of midpoints that you get right in the middle of the second act. Sometimes they are table turning midpoints. Sometimes they are revelatory midpoints where new information is revealed, and sometimes they're kind of more epiphanic. Sometimes it's more of an understanding that we arrive at, and that seems to be the kind of midpoint that we're dealing with here. It's enormously powerful, and then we get the crew coming together. Then we get having gone through this crucible, and you see there too, right? The integration. In that moment, Gwen is pretty integrated. In that moment, the rest of the crew is kind of stepping in behind Nesmith. Even as he is disavowing that integration, the others are actively integrated, I suppose. And that leads us into our final confrontation with Saris, or I guess our penultimate confrontation with Saris. We get the triggering of the Omega-13 device, which is a great kind of high concept plot thing, though that again introduces another kind of thematic framework. What would you give to go back and change one mistake? That's great and all, and this I think is its saving grace, is a completely appropriate moral question for an episode of Star Trek. That is absolutely the kind of thing that an episode of Star Trek would wrestle with, and has many times over. Absolutely has. Anytime you're dealing with time travel in the Star Trek universe, that notion comes up. What would you do to fix something right now? What would you do for another chance? But that's not the theme of the movie. And this is another way in which Galaxy Quest is both text and supertext. It is both a story itself and a commentary on stories like itself. It's not just parodic. It's not just pointing and laughing. It is simultaneously telling you a story, but also commenting upon that story. And that's, again, surprisingly sophisticated. And then I think, as I wrap up in the last couple of minutes that I have here, I'll try and squeeze in some questions just before we wrap up. Becca saying the Prime Directive always applies. It's not just the Prime Directive, you guys. It's the temporal Prime Directive. If you ever watched Deep Space Nine, you'll know how much trouble Benjamin Sisko had with the upholders of the temporal Prime Directive, because time travel, always a head scratcher over in the Star Trek universe. This, for me, is what separates Galaxy Quest from other stories of this type. It is the heart. Yes. It is the intent. Yes. It is the sophistication. Yes. It is a more careful, more artfully constructed, more precise and thoughtful movie than it appears to be. It is a mistake, I think, to look at Galaxy Quest as a broad stroke slapdash pastiche of Star Trek, or pastiche as it is commonly used there. I'm not even using that word technically, but a slapdash broad stroke parody of Star Trek. It's not that. What it is something with a great deal more identity. Galaxy Quest manages to do exactly what its heroes do in the course of the story. It manages to do exactly what the Thermians do in the course of the story. It manages to integrate these two halves of itself. It is the thing and the commentary upon the thing. It is both within the frame and the frame itself. And that is rare. And the more that I think about Galaxy Quest, the more time that I spend appreciating this movie and the careful kind of construction of this movie, the more I am put in mind of the works of Edgar Wright, who, for those of you who don't know, directed Shaun of the Dead and Hot Fuzz and The World's End and one of my favorite movies of all time, Scott Pilgrim versus the World. He is an enormously careful filmmaker. He is an enormously precise and dense filmmaker. And of course, Galaxy Quest has nothing of the density of an Edgar Wright movie, but there is something of the care. So the next time that you go and watch Galaxy Quest, which I hope won't be too far in the future, I urge you to pay very close attention. Pay very close attention to each individual character. Pay very close attention to the minor little details that we get of motivation, and think about the way that identity suffuses this film and gives it real thematic weight and heft and dimensionality. Let me check my question bucket here as I am wrapping up. Rayla Lynn asks, has anyone read Tim Allen's article about working with Rickman on this movie? I haven't read an article by Tim Allen about working with Alan Rickman on this movie, but I do know that when he was talking, goodness me, just last year maybe, he was talking about the possibility of a Galaxy Quest 2 or a Galaxy Quest reboot or a something, and did note with apparent, I shouldn't be so skeptical of Tim Allen. That's actually, I'm sure with a completely authentic and genuine heavy heart, observed that, of course, they would have to do it without Alan Rickman and that it wouldn't be the same. And that, I think, is definitely worth something. So what is the aspect ratio of the end credits with the remake of the show, says Lynn? They keep it in 235:1. It is a widescreen format. I went looking today because I was really hoping that they had moved it to 16:9, which is kind of modern television widescreen format, but they didn't. It's still just movie format. But I'm not even upset about that because, firstly, futzing with the format right at the beginning of the movie is so completely unnecessary. And secondly, widescreen looks like widescreen. It really doesn't matter to most viewers exactly what the ratio, what the dimensions of that widescreen image are. As long as it's widescreen, it looks like modern TV, modern cinema. Yeah. And John says, not really a question, but you should do a Last Starfighter one-shot. I love The Last Starfighter. I adore The Last Starfighter. Greetings, Starfighter. You've been recruited by the Star League to defend the frontier against Zur and the Kodan Armada. Yeah, I know me some Last Starfighter. I could talk about that anytime. That's another movie that is really, really interested in questions of identity. What's also fascinating about The Last Starfighter is that the structure plays out in some very unexpected ways. It plays out like a 1980s action adventure movie, so much more than it does a science fiction movie. It plays out in its structural mechanics much more like something like Teen Wolf, you know, kind of still speculative fiction, still a little, you know, broad. It plays like Back to the Future more than it plays like Galaxy Quest or, you know, Battlestar Galactica or something like that. It kind of leans away from its own genre and into the absolute kind of utter, you know, rock solid conventions of 1980s storytelling. I would love to do, maybe what I'll do, maybe there isn't quite enough to do a one shot on The Last Starfighter, though I fear that I probably could. Maybe what I'll do is look at The Last Starfighter and Flight of the Navigator together and just do both of those in the same one shot. I adore both of those films too. Okay. We're really into the idea of doing a Last Starfighter one shot. Let's do that. Oh, and Rayla Lynn says, talking about the Tim Allen article, it's very sweet. He talks about how intimidated he was by Rickman at first, but once they got to know each other, he thought Rickman was awesome. I can only imagine. There is another little interesting detail here that apparently all the way through the shoot for Galaxy Quest, Tim Allen was pestering Sigourney Weaver to have her sign I guess just chunk of the Nostromo that he had, you know, a prop that he had from Alien, and she didn't want to sign it. And hey, we're working together. Don't make this weird. I don't want to sign this right now. Thank you. But then ultimately signed it and wrote upon it, stolen by Tim Allen with love from Sigourney Weaver. And that apparently upset him a lot. That apparently, like, that was not what he wanted. And heaven help me if I don't just, you know, if my heart doesn't just warm a little bit toward Tim Allen when I think of him as a little broken-hearted fanboy kind of walking away from Sigourney Weaver, having had her sign a piece of the Nostromo and looking at it and thinking, no. I'm just, you know, I'm overlaying an emotional tenor and quality to that scene that it possibly didn't have in real life, but there it is. That is going to do it, though. You guys, this has been an absolute pleasure, an absolute blast. I didn't get to a lot of my notes, so I may have some thoughts on Galaxy Quest over on Twitter or something in the near future. But that is going to do it for this Point North Live one-shot. All of these one-shots are possible thanks to the generous support of my patrons over at patreon.com/pointnorthmedia. That's patreon.com/pointnorthmedia. Every dollar that is pledged over there helps me make more shows, and making more shows is the thing that I want to do more than anything else in all the world. So thank you all so much for your support. And if you would like to have a topic for a upcoming one-shot discussion, as Aaron is going to have in just a couple of weeks when I talk about the 1999 The Mummy movie with Brendan Fraser, which is just a knockout great film. If you would like to pick a topic for an upcoming one-shot, head on over to the Patreon page, and pledge your support. That is going to do it. I am losing the ability to form consonants. I have spoken very quickly indeed for the last hour, and now I need to go and sit in a darkened room with the rest of my glass of scotch, I suppose. Thank you so much for joining me. Never give up, never surrender. I'll talk to you all again soon. Take care.